Marvel Contest of Champions, a game with characters that have different abilities, different playstyles, different effects, as well as different strengths. In a game where a literal pig is doing more damage than Thanos himself, a game where the likes of Gwenpool can physically hurt Galactus himself, and a game where Nick Fury is much more capable than the likes of someone who has literal powers of telepathy. Yeah, it just doesn't make too much sense, man. The game is basically focused around different characters having unique different abilities, and so in most fights, there's two things that you can actually focus on. There's the damage perspective, and then there's the utility perspective. Now, in most low level fights, you pretty much want to always go with damage, and in cases where you need utility, you definitely do want to bring a utility champion, however damage you'd still want to go with. If a champion only brings utility and doesn't do that much damage, then it's pretty much better to just sacrifice utility in order to finish the fight that much faster. Which brings up the topic of power creep. Now, power creep, by the Google definition, is it's a common challenge in multiplayer games, especially those that involve progression, customization, and updates. It refers to the situation where new content or features make older ones obsolete or irrelevant, creating an imbalance and a loss of diversity in the game. Now, if we actually take a look at the newer champions compared to the older ones, you'll see that there's a very huge gap. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at the newly released champions of this year, you can pretty much tell that every single one of them is an absolute comic book to read. Not a single one of them is easy to master in a single day. Of course, not all of them are that hard to play as well, but the amount of abilities that each and every one of them has is absolutely absurd. But if we actually go ahead and compare it to the 2015 champions, there's a very big difference. So pretty much the best ones that you do have from this year are pretty much just the ones that got buffed. We have Hulk, we have Hulkbuster, we have Juggernaut, Ultron, the Magnetos, Venom, Joe Fixit, and that's pretty much it. I'm sure there's some that I missed, but these are pretty much the top competitors, and the thing that all of them have in common is that they've been buffed before. Now let's for a second just imagine these champions weren't buffed at all. There's a pretty large gap between the 2 years. And of course that is for a good reason as well. Of course Kabam wants to introduce new champions, and with every update they pretty much want people to be excited for new champions. And so they pretty much always have to bring something new to the table. None of these champions fail to deliver, except maybe Sandman, but the concepts and ideas surrounding these characters, all of them pretty much bring something new. And that's actually one thing that I really like about this game. There's no one specific character that you can point out and say that, oh, this other champion does that exact same thing. Each character is slightly different, and in situations where they sort of do the same thing, one of them tend to do something a little bit better or have another ability stacked on top of that. And so each and every character of course does feel different, but of course characters that were brought at the beginning of the game pretty much can't compete that much with the newer ones. And I'm talking about the likes of these characters you see on the screen right now. The likes of Black Widow, Iron Man, Abomination, Captain Marvel, Electro, Cyclops, maybe Vision. These are pretty much characters you'd never ever think of bringing to a fight if you have a better option. And this is where power creep comes up. All of these characters pretty much have a disadvantage, whether you bring them in war or whether you bring them in battlegrounds. There's no way you're gonna be performing better with these characters than the newer ones that we have. Now, one way Kabam does combat this is by bringing new synergies. For example, the Red Guardian synergy that allows Abomination to pretty much place a poison, which increases his damage output very significantly to a point where you pretty much just say, just put it in his base abilities. And the recent buffs that we've gotten to the older characters, there are a few duds here and there, but you also can't gloss over the ones that completely change characters. We had the Juggernaut buff, we had the Ultron buff, we've had a Crossbones buff as well as a Falcon buff, and so many more other buffs that we've gotten. But of course, Kabam this month decided to not buff any of the older champions, which still complicates the ratio of usable champions versus non-usable. But also one thing that keeps power creep a little bit toned down is the inclusion of nodes in a certain fight. Certain nodes pretty much limit the use of certain overpowered champions, and a certain number of node combinations can pretty much thin it down to only a handful of champions usable in a certain fight. And so in my opinion, the game definitely is suffering from power creep, but it of course has its saving graces in the form of synergies, in the form of buffs, and in the form of nodes restricting the use of more popular champions. But not a single node will pretty much make you go back to playing Iron Man, but of course with the addition of a buff, he can become more useful. Also on the discussion of synergies, if a champion pretty much needs a synergy in order to be useful, then please just add the synergy to their base kit.
Kalau tidak,